When the Crusaders marched eastward during the so-called Fourth Crusade, a shadow darker than the smoke of war descended upon the Orthodox monasteries. To the armed pilgrims, any land that did not swear obedience to Rome was seen as an enemy. Amid forested hills and mist-covered valleys stood dozens of women's monasteries, sanctuaries of silence, prayer, and labour. Those places, long forgotten by the world, suddenly became visible targets for an army that advanced without restraint. In the nights before the storm, nuns wrote in chronicles now lost that they had seen strange lights along the roads, as if torches without hands were approaching the sacred walls. Some sisters spoke of omens, owls calling in daylight, the sudden silence of orchards, the water in wells turning cloudy. None of them could imagine the scale of the disaster to come. News travelled with the speed of fear. An exhausted messenger reached a monastery near the Aegean coast to warn that an army of thousands was approaching, not to liberate the Holy Land, but to plunder Christian cities. "They are Crusaders," he said, "but they are not bearers of faith, only of ambition." They had looted towns, burned churches, and desecrated relics. Nothing seemed to stop them. The nuns of the Orthodox monasteries knew they were not warriors. Their only defence was prayer. Yet even they sensed that something darker than war itself was about to engulf them. Stories spread of temples torn down, libraries destroyed, and entire communities forced to flee their homes. When the first Crusader scouts appeared among the trees, the monastery bells rang without pause. The sisters sought refuge inside the main church, believing that the sacred walls would protect them. They carried with them ancient icons, some more than 5 centuries old, painted by hands long gone and blessed by generations of the faithful. But the knights were not seeking souls. They sought wealth. Monasteries, with their silver chalices, reliquary chests, and illuminated manuscripts, were easy prey. The nuns braced for the inevitable, securing the doors with iron bars that seemed far too thin against an enemy that had crossed seas and mountains. The night the troops finally arrived, a thin crescent moon hung over the valley. Torches illuminated the walls as wooden doors groaned under the weight of makeshift battering rams. The sound echoed through the valley like a heart beating against too small a chest. The sisters sang hymns, not to seek earthly salvation, but to remain steadfast as they heard the doors collapse. When the Crusaders entered, the church was consumed by chaos, shadow, and fire. There was no mercy for the monastic life. The knights saw the nuns not as consecrated women, but as subjects of a rival empire. The Crusaders tore down tapestries, smashed icons, and opened chests in search of gold. The manuscripts that the nuns had copied for decades burned in improvised bonfires. Those pages filled with prayers, history, genealogies, and theological treatises turned to ash that floated like black snow. The nuns tried to protect their oldest relics, including a fragment of the mantle of a revered martyr of the Eastern Church. But the invaders made no distinction between relic and jewel. Anything of material value was seized, wrapped, and loaded onto carts of loot. The sisters were gathered in the central courtyard. Some wept, others remained silent, eyes fixed on the ground. Many had devoted their entire lives to the service of God. None could have imagined that violence would come not from infidels, but from fellow Christians. The Crusaders imposed humiliating conditions, demanding the monastery's lands, gardens, livestock, and every object of value. Though the community had little left to offer, the pressure became unbearable. The nuns' suffering was not for material loss, but for witnessing their spiritual world collapse before their eyes. At dawn, with charred walls and broken doors, the nuns were forced to abandon their home. Each carried only a small cloth bag with the bare essentials. The ground was still covered in ash. Some knelt to kiss the earth one last time. To them, the monastery was not just a building. It was their history, their identity, their entire life. They walked for days toward remote regions, seeking refuge in poor villages where peasants, horrified by the stories of the Crusade, offered them shelter. Though they found compassion, the weight of trauma never left them. Over time, many Western chroniclers silenced what had happened. The official narrative spoke of a crusade to liberate the Holy Land, but few pages mentioned the devastation inflicted upon Eastern Christian communities. The testimonies of the surviving nuns were relegated to local manuscripts, hidden for centuries. Yet, in the monasteries rebuilt generations later, the sisters passed down the memory of that catastrophe. For them, it was not about revenge or resentment, but about preserving the truth, that the suffering had been real, that their faith had been tested, and that even in the darkest nights, they had endured. Today, as historians revisit forgotten chronicles and rediscovered archives, the story reemerges, and not as an accusation, but as a reminder of the cost of fanaticism and human ambition. The destroyed monasteries were rebuilt, the communities reborn, and the voices of the surviving nuns continue to inspire those who seek historical justice. The story that was once silenced now stands as a solemn testimony. The Crusaders did not only fight infidels, they also left deep scars upon Christian peoples who never expected to become victims of their own brothers in faith. The final message of this dark chapter is not despair, but spiritual resistance. Despite the devastation, the monastic communities rebuilt themselves through the effort of generations. The new sisters once again copied manuscripts, restored icons, and prayed for the memory of those who had suffered. Darkness did not have the last word. Faith did. Among the most haunting testimonies preserved in local chronicles is the account of a small monastery in the mountains of Thrace. Only a dozen sisters lived there. The place was so isolated that travellers called it the house where only God can find the way. When the Crusader troops advanced through that region, a dense fog covered the valley. No one knew how the soldiers found the monastery, for the paths were unmarked. Yet they did. The hooves of their horses echoed through the dawn as if darkness itself had footsteps. By morning, the monastery no longer existed. Its walls had been reduced to smoking ruins. Villagers from nearby settlements found only burnt fragments of manuscripts and broken pieces of icons. Of the sisters, there was no trace. Some chronicles, written decades later, claimed they were forced to march with the invaders. Others said they vanished into the mist to hide forever. But none confirmed the truth. The Crusaders sought not only gold or jewels, but also ancient icons, many covered in gold leaf or precious stones. To them, these were treasures. To the nuns, they were windows to the divine. In one Macedonian monastery, the sisters had protected for centuries an icon called the Face That Never Forgets, attributed to an artist of the first millennium. It was said that whoever looked upon it with faith could feel a profound peace, as if the entire world had fallen silent. When the Crusaders stormed that monastery, the first thing they did was tear the icon from its altar. According to a manuscript that survived in distant exile, the sisters saw it disappear amid the chaos, illuminated by the flames devouring the wooden choir. That icon was never seen again in Western Europe. Centuries later, some claim to have seen it in private collections, always surrounded by tragedy. Every owner who possessed it suffered loss, fire, or sudden ruin. But that belongs to the realm of legend. After being expelled from their homes, many nuns began a long march toward safer lands. Some walked for weeks without rest, surviving only on wild fruits and rainwater. Their robes were torn by thorns, their feet marked by deep wounds. During one particularly harsh winter, a group of sisters crossed frozen mountains to seek refuge in a small monastery hidden among cliffs. They were received with compassion, but also with fear, for bringing stories of destruction seemed to invite the shadow of the crusade itself. Still, they survived. They taught the younger nuns the art of manuscript copying, preserved ancient hymns, and rebuilt communal life. Their suffering became a silent legacy. Many accounts of the abuses committed by the Crusader troops were deliberately silenced by Western scribes. Some religious orders considered these stories inconvenient for the heroic memory of the Crusades. But in Orthodox monasteries, the nuns wrote their experiences on parchment hidden inside wooden chests. These manuscripts, called the Laments, were buried beneath stone floors to keep them from falling into the hands of the invaders. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered fragments, lists of names, poems of sorrow, descriptions of church fires, and pleas for future generations to remember the truth. Many were damaged or incomplete, but their voices endured. The tragedy extended beyond the monasteries. In major cities of the Eastern Christian world, entire populations suffered the violence of looting. During the sack of Constantinople alone, thousands perished in just a few days. While most Western chroniclers described the event as a military triumph, Eastern accounts tell another story. Destroyed temples, entire neighborhoods razed, and women forced to witness devastation they could not stop. For the nuns in urban convents, the chaos was even closer. Many monasteries were turned into barracks, stables, or warehouses. The sound of prayer was replaced by clashing swords, rough laughter, and drunken disputes. In coastal areas, some nuns tried to flee by sea. At night, small groups gathered on hidden beaches, waiting for fishing boats willing to risk their lives to take them to safer islands. One tale tells of a boat overloaded with sisters, attempting to escape near the coast of Asia Minor. The sea was violent, the wind fierce, and the waves rose like walls of water. But they had no choice. They climbed aboard, prayed, and set off into the darkness. At dawn, the boat reached an island. Miraculously, none had died. The sisters attributed their salvation to divine intervention. That island became a temporary refuge for many displaced communities. One of the most memorable episodes occurred when a monastery surrounded by forest was set on fire by Crusader troops to prevent anyone from escaping. The flames spread rapidly, fed by the dry wood of summer. Smoke could be seen from miles away. The nuns fled into the forest before the soldiers could close in. For hours they hid among the trees, listening to the crackle of flames, the shouts of soldiers, and the collapse of their home. When night fell, they found shelter in a nearby cave. They spent several days there without food or water. But they survived. And in time, they founded a new convent farther north, preserving the memory of the disaster. Though the Crusaders returned to the west with immense treasures, they left behind a dark echo that endured through the centuries. In many regions of the Balkans and Asia Minor, elders told stories of the men who came from the sea with crosses, armour and fire. For Orthodox communities, the crusade was not liberation. It was a deep wound. Even centuries later, churches held special masses in memory of the sisters who died or vanished during that time. With time, many monasteries were rebuilt, sometimes over the same ruins, sometimes elsewhere. Later generations of nuns inherited not only the traditions but also the pain of those who suffered. In some convents, every year on a certain night, the names of the missing sisters were read aloud, not to relive the horror, but to honour their sacrifice. Faith endured. The community survived. Today, as historians cross-reference ancient documents and compare Eastern and Western chronicles, the truth becomes clearer. The violence against Orthodox monasteries was not an accident, but a direct result of political and economic ambition disguised as faith. The suffering of the nuns was immense, but their spiritual endurance left a lasting mark. The story that was once hidden is now told openly, not as an act of hatred, but as a warning of what happens when fanaticism eclipses humanity. And so, in the reconstructed halls of today's monasteries, the voices of those sisters still resonate in every prayer, reminding the world that even in the deepest darkness, the light of truth always finds its way.